On February 25, 2022, 5 experienced divers descended into the waters off Trinidad's coast for what should have been routine maintenance work. Within hours, 4 would be trapped in an underwater nightmare, fighting for survival inside a 30-inch oil pipeline. One man would emerge with an unbelievable story of survival. 4 others would never return home. But what turned this ordinary repair job into one of diving's most horrific disasters? And why were desperate rescue attempts blocked when lives hung in the balance? Tonight, we dive into a tragedy that shook the diving world and exposed fatal flaws in emergency response protocols. Imagine being trapped in complete darkness inside a steel pipe barely wider than your shoulders, your eyes burning from oil, your air running out. For Christopher Boodram, this nightmare became reality when a routine diving job turned into a desperate fight for survival. But while he managed to escape, 4 of his fellow divers remained trapped, alive, praying, and waiting for a rescue that would never come. This is the story of the 2022 Caribbean diving disaster, a tragedy that didn't have to end in death. There's something especially terrifying about being trapped in a confined space. Now, imagine that space is a dark, oil-filled pipeline at the bottom of the ocean. In 2022, 5 experienced divers found themselves in exactly that situation. But what happened next wasn't just scary. It was infuriating, because while 4 men fought for their lives inside that pipe, the people who could have saved them chose not to. This is easily one of the most disturbing diving incidents I've ever covered, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why it never should have happened. The men behind the mission. Let's meet the 5 men who arrived at Pointe-à-Pierre Harbor that morning. Christopher Boodram, an experienced underwater welder who would soon face the fight of his life. Faisal Kurban, age 57, a veteran diver whose own father had died in an oil platform explosion decades earlier in 1985. Yusuf Henry, just 31 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. Kazim Ali Jr., 37, whose father owned the contracting company they worked for. And Rishi Nagasar, 48, leaving behind a wife who would later become a vocal advocate for justice. These weren't just names on a work order. They were skilled professionals who had done this kind of work countless times before. All 5 worked for Land and Marine Contracting Services, or LMCS, a company contracted by the state-owned Peria Fuel Trading Company. They were the kind of men who built their lives around one of the most demanding and dangerous professions in the world. Little did they know that this ordinary workday would put them at the center of a tragedy that would shake their nation to its core. This is Pointe-à-Pierre Harbor, home to Trinidad's largest oil refinery, where massive underwater pipelines snake beneath the surface. These pipes are about 30 inches in diameter that stretch nearly 1,200 feet from sea to shore. The job that morning seemed straightforward: repair work on a section of underwater pipeline. To do this, they used a hyperbaric chamber. Think of it as an underwater workshop that lets divers work in a dry environment below the surface. But beneath this routine setup lurked an invisible killer. Nearly a month earlier, the pipeline had been cleared of oil, creating what diving experts call a delta P situation, short for differential pressure. Imagine a vacuum so powerful it could suck a full-grown adult through an opening the size of a dinner plate in seconds. This deadly force had been silently waiting, like a coiled spring, ready to release its lethal power. The disaster strikes. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The team was working on removing an inflatable plug from the pipeline, a routine task they'd done many times before. But this time was different. This time, the delta P effect created a vortex of unstoppable force. In mere seconds, all 5 men were violently sucked into the pipeline like a giant underwater vacuum cleaner. Think about that for a moment. Being pulled through a dark, oil-coated tube barely wider than your shoulders. No way to turn around. No way to know which direction leads to safety. Complete darkness, except for whatever light your diving gear could provide. This wasn't just a confined space. It was a steel tomb threatening to become their final resting place. A GoPro camera, later recovered from one of the divers, revealed the horrifying truth of those first moments. The men were alive inside the pipeline, their voices captured in what would become crucial evidence. They could be heard praying together, trying to comfort each other in the pitch blackness. These recordings would later haunt investigators and loved ones alike, proving the men had survived the initial incident. The fight for survival. For Christopher Boodram, what followed was 3 hours of living hell. With an injured arm and burning eyes, he fought his way through the oil-filled pipeline. It was like an unbelievable nightmare, he would later testify. Your eyes are burning. Every time you try to open your eyes, it burns. It's pitch black. You cannot see anything. But in this darkness, a remarkable display of brotherhood emerged. His fellow divers, still trapped deeper in the pipe, helped guide him toward safety. Despite their own desperate situation, they directed him which way to go, a selfless act that would save his life while sealing their own fate. When Boodram finally saw a faint light ahead, he thought it was the angel of death. I started seeing a little light in the habitat, he recalled. I swear to God it was the angel of death coming for me. The blocked rescue. What happened next would become the most controversial chapter of this tragedy. As soon as Boodram emerged, he desperately pleaded with officials to rescue his colleagues. They're alive, he said, knowing every second counted. Michael Kerbin, son of trap diver Fazell Kerbin, quickly assembled a team of volunteer rescue divers. These weren't ordinary volunteers. These were experienced professionals who understood the risks. They could hear knocking coming from inside the pipe, clear proof that survivors were waiting for help. Andrew Farah, one of the rescue divers, testified that they were willing to die to save their colleagues. But instead of getting approval, they hit a wall of bureaucracy that would prove fatal for those trapped inside. The corporate response. Peria officials and the Coast Guard blocked all rescue attempts, citing safety concerns. While rescue divers begged to attempt a rescue, Peria's terminal operations manager, Colin Piper, remained unmoved. The company claimed they needed to wait for camera footage from inside the pipe before attempting any rescue. Hours ticked by as they waited for technology while human lives hung in the balance. Even more shockingly, Peria would later admit they had no rescue plan in place. They argued they had no legal responsibility to rescue the men, a statement that would later come back to haunt them. The Coast Guard, when questioned, admitted they couldn't help because they weren't trained for pipeline rescue. Meanwhile, qualified rescue divers stood by, prevented from doing what they were trained to do. The tragic waiting game. For up to 48 hours, 4 men remained trapped in that pipeline. Outside Peria's gates, families protested desperately, supported by the oilfield workers' trade union. Rescue divers stood ready to help, their equipment prepared, their courage unwavering. The nation watched in horror as nothing was done to save these men. It wasn't until nearly 12 hours after the incident that Peria even sent remote cameras into the pipeline. By then, hopes of finding survivors had dimmed considerably. The families described the agonizing wait, made worse by poor communication from company officials. One family member described it as watching their loved ones being treated like tools that simply fell into a pipe. The aftermath and investigation. The recovery of bodies would stretch over several days. 3 bodies were recovered by February 28th, but Rishi Nagasar's body wouldn't be found until March 3rd. The nation's outrage grew as details emerged about how the tragedy was handled. An online petition calling for the dismissal of Peria's board gathered over 50,000 signatures. In November 2023, the Commission of Inquiry delivered its damning verdict. This wasn't just an accident. It was a gross negligence and consequently criminal. The report condemned Peria's actions, particularly their point-blank refusal to allow rescue attempts. They had failed in every aspect of emergency response, from planning to execution. The human cost. Christopher Boodram, the sole survivor, continues to battle the trauma of that day. He can no longer work as a diver, haunted by nightmares and flashbacks of the incident. He says, "Sometimes I think it might have been easier for me and my family if I had died." The families of the deceased haven't received 1 black cent in compensation while their fight for justice continues. The legal battle. By September 2024, charges were finally filed against both Peria and LMCS. Company executives faced 15 charges under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The case continues through the legal system, with the next hearing scheduled for May 2025. But for the families left behind, no court verdict can bring back what they've lost. Lessons written in lives. This tragedy wasn't just about equipment failure or technical mistakes. It exposed a system that prioritized procedure over human life. It revealed how corporate bureaucracy can turn a rescue operation into a recovery mission. And it showed how the absence of proper emergency protocols can turn a survivable accident into a fatal disaster. Today, the 2022 Caribbean diving disaster shows us how quickly routine work can turn deadly and how crucial immediate rescue response can be. Most importantly, it tells us that when lives hang in the balance, no protocol or procedure should stand in the way of attempting a rescue. Because in the end, while we can replace equipment and repair pipelines, we can never replace a human life. Thanks for watching.